So for more, we now welcome Eric Mandel, the founder and director of the Middle East Political and Information Network from New York, Khaled Elgindy, a senior fellow and director of Palestinian-Israeli Affairs Program at the Middle East Institute and author of Blind Spot, America and the Palestinians from Balfour to Trump, joining us from Washington. And here in our Tel Aviv studio, retired Colonel Dr. Jacques Neria, former deputy head of assessment in the Israeli military intelligence and former foreign policy advisor to Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. Gentlemen, thank you all so much for your time on this very special day. So I want to start with you, Eric. Voting underway in the most unusual of circumstances. The coronavirus pandemic, obviously such a huge factor in these polls, but I want to move on to the significance of this election for the Middle East, particularly given the current tight relations between Jerusalem and Washington. How different do you think this will look under a Biden-Harris administration?
Well, it would behoove a Biden-Harris administration not to, as we would say, throw the baby out with the bathwater and throw out all of Trump's initiatives here, many of which he disagree with. The reason that is because it will afford the new administration leverage, whether it's with the Iranians, the Palestinians, the Turks, the Saudis. And so we'll just quickly break that down. The biggest issue that they're going to confront is Iran. And they have said that if Iran goes back into compliance with the JCPOA, they will go back in and enforce the JCPOA. That would be a huge mistake because Iran is suffering under the sanctions and there were many flaws in the agreement, and the Biden administration, for American national security interest, should address those, like unlimited research and development, and the fact that there is really a pathway now for an industrial-sized nuclear program, which undermines not only Israel's interests, but America's interests. Regarding the Palestinians, Vice President-elect, if she is Harris, has already said that the U.S. will reopen the PLO embassy in Washington, open up the consulate again in Jerusalem. What they should do is, before any of these things occur, including funding, have some reciprocity from the Palestinians about decreasing incitement, and they shouldn't bite off more than they can chew regarding opening up with the current Palestinian Authority any negotiations. Turkey will be right on the table right from the beginning. Turkey has become a frenemy. It's a frenemy to Israel. It's a frenemy to America. And Saudi Arabia, I'll leave it off with that. The Biden administration really is worried about dealing with Saudi Arabia because its involvement in Yemen and the Khashoggi affair. And basically, they need to realize that America has interests in these regions. It doesn't share values in this region. And so we really, as America, what I will talk to Congress about is, other than with Israel, who we do share values with, we really have to pick and choose what we're going to do and realize. Right. Yeah, just the last thing I'll just say is in the Middle East, the Gordian knot to untie is not the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as most notably seen with the normalization agreements.
Thank you. Stay with us. We've got more to discuss. I want to bring you in right now, Khaled, because I want to hear your thoughts on what we just heard there, particularly on relations between the U.S. and the Palestinians, who had accused Washington of being a dishonest peace broker in the past under the Trump administration, but things could be very different or not in the coming hours, days, or weeks. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that the Trump administration was in many ways a huge departure from previous administrations in terms of its rhetoric and its official policies. It wasn't all that different in terms of its actual policies as opposed to its official statements, in the sense that the United States has always had its thumb on the scale as a mediator between Israelis and Palestinians in Israel's favor. I don't think that is a controversial point. What's different about Trump is the not just bias toward Israel, but the really unmitigated hostility toward the Palestinians, and the extent to which the Trump administration reflected the most far-right views in Israel and in the United States, the Greater Israel agenda that Ambassador David Friedman embraces and that Jared Kushner sympathizes with, is one that only a tiny fringe of American public and politics actually adheres to. But even if it is sort of mainstream in Israeli politics, which over the last 20 years have moved steadily to the right. So I think we will see a mild correction in Biden's approach, if in fact he's elected, where he will try to undo some of the most damaging things like the total cutoff of aid to the Palestinians, severing diplomatic ties on both ends. Where we won't see a changes and things like he probably won't move the embassy back to Tel Aviv. And I don't expect him actually to take up the Palestinian-Israeli issue as a matter of priority. He will have his hands full with a very robust domestic agenda. And even in terms of foreign policy, the Palestinian issue is further down the list. I also wouldn't expect to see an enormous emphasis on normalization with Arab states. I think that's something that the Trump administration pursued at the expense of the Palestinian issue and in order to marginalize the Palestinian issue. I think certainly Biden embraces the idea of Israel being normalized and recognized by Arab states, but it won't become a fixation or an obsession the way it has been for the Trump administration.
And all in the space of a very short time. In fact, Jacques, I want to bring you in because it was 3 normalization deals that we've just been discussing, happening in the space of around 6 weeks, and obviously a feather in the cap at the time for Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu. We kept on hearing about other countries that were going to follow suit. Given what we've just been discussing, do you think that is likely? Do you think the countries we've been hearing, Oman, Morocco, even Saudi Arabia, would even explore channels if it wasn't Donald Trump at the helm?
Well, let us not hurry in burying Donald Trump. He still has 2 months.
It's a big if.
And, you know, and always the American president is the American president till the last day of his presidency. And he can make decisions at the last moment. And I think that this will continue. I mean, this trend will continue. There are things that you do in foreign policy that when you do them, you cannot go back. And certainly, opening with Sudan, opening with the Emirates, with Bahrain, Oman, and other states, this will continue to be. The problem is the vice versa. How all those allies today will look at America if Biden is going to adopt the same Obama policy concerning Iran, giving a priority to Iran. And rather than going on the Arab world, this is what the Arab world right now is looking at. All the allies around Israel are looking at this issue to see how the American administration is going to react. Remember, Trump was the one who championed the idea of leaving the Middle East, and finally he is there with 250 American combatants in North Kurdistan in Syria. So I mean, there are some ideas that cannot change. There are certain principles that cannot change, and hopefully, I mean, the defense of Israel and security of Israel will remain paramount with the Biden administration if he wins.
And of course, we keep on saying it's a big if. We have quite a while to go until there is clarity. And of course, then, we have to ask the question about acceptance. But that is down the line. Right now, Eric, I want to ask you to come back into the discussion about Iran and the U.S. maximum pressure campaign. Israel has always made its views on Tehran clear. What does all of this mean right now for the nuclear deal?
Well, first of all, I'm an American who advises Americans in Congress for American national security interests that, to my mind, are coincident with Israel's at this point, probably 95% of the time. Iran is not just Israel, but to America, its largest threat there. And I think what America needs to change is not think of this part of the world as Sunni and Shiite. I think the way they need to put Iran in here is that Iran is a political Islamist that is Shiite and non-Arab, that works with Turkish Sunni non-Arabs, that works with Qatar, which is a Sunni Arab group. So it doesn't make sense to a lot of American foreign policy people how the world has been rearranged, whereas you have the Arab monarchies, the conservative, if you will, moderate monarchies, working with the Jewish state. So they have to first reorient from how they used to think about things. Secondly, the JCPOA was a very flawed agreement. I was working in the Senate, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee when this was going on, and there were many things there that really need to be changed because, one, inspections don't go on in military sites, which is where most of the clandestine work will go on. Research and development goes on unlimited, and they don't need that if they really just want energy. We gave a terror state the right to enrich, which was a little crazy. And the promise of President Obama and Vice President Biden was this would end their nuclear program, their ability to get a nuclear weapon. And in fact, they are going to have international approval at the end. So I strongly urge the Biden administration to step back and to look at a renegotiation of this deal and be patient if we don't get everything we want. The real, their currency has fallen. They're in very dire straits, not just from the sanctions, but for the coronavirus. And so we really have leverage on Iran at this time. And also, Iran's not going to make a deal right away because they have a presidential election coming up in the spring. So the JCPOA, the Iran agreement, is going to be a priority, but going right back into compliance with it, if the Iranians do, is to Iranian advantage and not to American advantage, and certainly not to Israeli interests.
Khaled, I want to go back to those three normalization deals that we've seen between Israel, the UAE, Bahrain, and of course, more recently, Sudan. When these deals happened, it seemed for the most part that the Palestinian issue was pretty much ignored, and there was a sentiment that that would happen down the line. Discussions might happen down the line. Do you think right now there is potentially a window of opportunity for more normalization that shouldn't be missed on the one hand, on the other hand, for Palestinians to get in on the action, so to speak?
I will tackle that question, but I just want to go back to something that that Eric said. I think it's a bit of an exaggeration to say that U.S. and Israeli interests align 95% of the time. I think we are the reality is that in two very important ways they absolutely don't align. First, with regard to the Palestinians, it is in the United States' interest to have a Palestinian state. It is in the U.S. interest and also a reflection of American values to end the subjugation of an entire people who are ruled by a country whose government they are not allowed to vote for and who are basically living under military dictatorship. So it is, I think, a reflection of both American values and American interests to see Palestinians free. Second, with regard to Iran, it is in the national security interest of the United States to pursue a diplomatic arrangement with Iran that precludes the development of nuclear weapons. And so I would expect very much that a Biden administration would re-enter the JCPOA, perhaps under slightly renegotiated terms here and there. But the alternative to a diplomatic arrangement is continued squeezing of the Iranian people who are bearing the brunt of these really draconian sanctions. And ultimately, the end game can only be military in terms of a war with Iran. And that's not something that is in America's interest. As we've seen in the past, American interventions in the region have not gone terribly well. So both of those, there is not just daylight with Israel, but huge gaping chasms where we don't share Israeli interests, and we should be pursuing our interests independently of where Tel Aviv is. As far as normalization, I mean, I don't think there's an opportunity to get Palestinians on board because the normalization process is designed to marginalize the Palestinians, both as a people and as an issue on the political agenda. So this isn't, Sudan is not under Israeli occupation. The UAE and Israel have never faced each other in battle. These are transactional arrangements. They are not transformational. This is more about the consolidation of a geopolitical alliance directed mainly at trying to contain the threat from Iran,
right,
and others in the region. But it's not something that is really about regional stability. The Sudan agreement, I would say, is the most transactional because it was achieved primarily through arm twisting and coercion. This is not a Sudanese government that was eager to normalize, but came under enormous pressure. It is in the midst of a very delicate transition and has tremendous economic problems and huge inflation and so forth. And they are desperate to get out from under these crippling sanctions. And so that's not an example of American diplomacy as much as it is coercion.
Right. I want to bring in final thoughts from Jacques, weighing in on what we've just heard.
Well, it's obvious that we do not share the same views, and I don't think that the Palestinians are suffering. The 95% of the Palestinians are living under Palestinian rule and not under Israeli rule. They enjoy quite an autonomy, and I think that if we look historically, that during the presidency of Clinton, when it was offered to the Palestinians to get more than 99% of the territory, it was Arafat who refused. And since then, it was always a refusal, Palestinian refusal to Israeli. And as Abba, even at the time, they said, and it's always right, they never lose an occasion to lose one more time. As far as the situation in the region is concerned, it is quite obvious that the Arab states today are trying to look at Iran and see how they devise their steps in case the Biden administration will restart the negotiation with Iran. And this will definitely bring those Emirates and those kingdoms back to the Israeli fold, as we had in 2015 when we met with the delegation of the Saudi delegation led by the General Ashki. So this is definitely what is going to happen if the administration is going to restart negotiation. And this would be the biggest mistake that the American administration could do facing Iran, because they don't understand what Iran is looking after. Iran is looking after a hegemony over all the area, not only on Lebanon, on Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, but definitely on the Muslim world. And this is the real confrontation between Islam coming from Tehran with the Walid, al-Taqlid, and so on, and the other Arab states. In between, Israel has a special place, and this special place has to be protected. And I think that the American administration, with its change, will remain loyal to Israel and to its security.
Well, certainly many layers in a complicated region. Dr. Jacques Neria here in Tel Aviv, Khaled Elgindy in Washington, and Eric Mandel in New York. Thank you, gentlemen, for your time and your insight.